that the people who were involved in these decisions actually understood how and why they were being generated.
And how does the whole thing work? Well, every week at the end of the week, we would send for our location, SKU, level information related to inventory, pricing, costs, purchase orders, sales. They would update their forecasts, run the models, and send the inventory recommendations back. Sometimes 4R calls that the fuel.
Exactly. Our model is a little bit, we believe that a lot of people have systems that actually do a lot of the operational things that they need to do quite well, and that if we can just get better fuel or better decision points into that system, that the company can experience a lot more profitability without actually having to replace and rip up and change their infrastructure.
So we very simply incorporated that fuel into our process. Under the microscope, I think certainly, the pilot was going to be not just the make or break for store replenishment. It's really kind of the make or break for the whole thing. What we did was, within IT, we have functional architects, and one of the functional architects was assigned full-time, and during the pilot, reviewed every order, reviewed, with the pilot stores, conference called with them every week, was on site at least one store each week, worked with them, so that we were getting good feedback. Confidence, well, the thing that I can say about confidence is that it largely comes from having good results. But at the same time, we were very conscious of not letting, let's say, a less than perfect result of a few SKUs sort of taint the whole thing.
But one of the challenges when you look at that closely, at all of these decisions, and given the fact that it's more of a probability game and you're always going to have some losers and winners, is really keeping a focus on, are we making good decisions en masse across all of the portfolio, and how are we doing on that? And one of the things that Ed's team did a great job of is really transmitting that insight to the organization, that we'll always find exceptions where we can say, geez, we should have done this. But the real question was, when we looked at all of the answers in balance, were we actually making more money out of the system, and were we understanding how we were getting that money out? So when we optimize store inventory levels, there are a couple of things that we'd like to talk about. One, clearly, is what's the measurable business impact, and I'll talk about that. And then Ed will talk about what the store staff experienced and what the feedback from the stores were, basically what the qualitative side of the equation was. On this chart, and let me take a moment to explain it. The black line in the middle is when we started the pilot, and to the left is basically pre-pilot, and to the post is the post-pilot period. The red line is an index that shows what the relationship of lost sales in the pilot stores were to the rest of the chain. So the blue line is kind of an average for the pre-period, and what it shows is over the prior period, or before we turned on the profit-optimized inventory recommendations, that the pilot stores were at about 20% more lost sales than the rest of the chain. The moment we turned on the optimized recommendations and flowed them to the stores and they started to operate on them, what we found was that the pilot stores dropped down to about 60% of the lost sales of the chain. And so that was an immediate reduction, or cutting in half of the amount of lost sales relative to the rest of the chain.
I think a secondary point on this is lost sales as a metric. I think historically we certainly have looked at all the standard retail metrics, weeks of supply, turn, etc. And I will say those continue to be very important.
Sure.
But I think we decided up front that how we were in large part with regard to store replenishment going to measure success was with lost sales. Jerry could probably talk a little bit more on, statistically and so forth, how we measured that. But what we did was, yes, use some statistical measures, but had experienced people in the company also sort of look at the numbers and validate them.
Right.
And then we established kind of the methodology early on as kind of a benchmark, and we kept that constant through the whole project.
Right. And what we have are some models that were developed by our founders that help us understand when events occur, stockout events occur, what the associated lost sales look like with those events. And I think the important thing is, rather than using intermediate variables like in-stock or service level, the real reason why we invest in inventory is to service the total demand. And what we really wanted to do was get a good, crisp, clear notion of what that looks like. Now, so clearly here we reduce the amount of lost sales. And one other point, actually, that's important is that some of the insights we had into where lost sales would be reduced were actually relatively high-level insights. And so, in fact, in this pilot period, the rest of the chain actually had started implementing, I think to some degree, some movement in those directions as well on a macro basis in certain classes of goods.
Well, and in fact, this is the thing I was going to sort of talk about in the findings, but really as a part of the benchmarking. There were some overall philosophical insights that, suggested to us that there overall was a better way. And although we try to keep it quiet, those insights did get out to the stores.
So one way to lower lost sales is to put in more inventory. And in fact, as much as our initial benchmark analysis showed that the amount of inventory that would be needed to change for Crate & Barrel as an entire company was small and like 2% more, it turned out these particular pilot stores were actually under inventory. They were at about 80% of the inventory cost relative to sales as the rest of the chain. And our optimized results basically said that that inventory should be raised, and we figured out what products to put it into. And as a result, we brought it up more closely aligned with what the rest of the chain's inventory level was. So that obviously did help boost and capture some of the lost sales. But the real important point was that by putting those two costs together, the cost of a lost sale and the cost of inventory, the net impact of the change in those two costs is actually an improvement in profitability. So in this particular case, we lowered those costs by about to roughly 80% of that of the rest of the chain. And so we actually improved profitability a fair amount, and actually that was fairly compelling to Crate & Barrel. So if we look at the net economic impact, what we did was lost sales and associated margins dropped significantly. We did raise the inventory in those pilot stores. I don't think we've done that in the chain as much. The net of margin recapture and extra inventory costs led to increased profits. And it also provided better customer service because we lowered lost sales, and I think there's a lot of evidence to that. And to kind of move on to that particular point, rather than just the numbers, I think Ed can talk a little bit about what was the impact on in-store inventory, store operations, and what they saw as a company.
I think the key word on this slide is really better tuned. The inventory levels were better tuned. I think you really kind of saw three types of tuning or adjustments. I think there were those things that came out of the benchmark where you could say, hey, this is a clear sort of philosophical method change, which was easily applied. What we also saw were, when we took all the sort of the detailed results and you sum them up for a class, you would see a trend. And for some classes, the vast majority of the items in the class, the inventory was increased or decreased. And again, in taking kind of a look at it, and really sort of understanding what the product was, you'd say, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Right.
And again, there was maybe overarching sort of philosophical change that could be applied.
Well, and if I can make a point, even in that macro change where we took a whole class and we took it up in inventory, I think that Crate, before we actually started setting those inventory in a lot of the rest of the chain stores, we're operationalizing that at kind of a class level and a chain level. As we rolled it through the rest of the chain, we actually then fine-tuned that. So some stores may have gotten too much inventory in that class, some too little. and so we shifted it around from store to store. But in general, there was actually a quick benefit to shifting the total inventory position in some classes.
Right. But I think mostly, I think if you were to look in total at the SKU counts, it was more the subtle micro type change. This SKU, the inventory was up a little bit. This SKU, the inventory was brought down a little bit. Many SKUs really not changed a lot. I think the other key point that I would bring out on the slide is the store management being smarter on managing inventory. Lots of points that could be discussed on that, but one of the most interesting to me was they're expressing how they were now understanding infrequent events versus flukes. You're going along, you're selling 10, 12 a week, and then somebody comes in and wants 48. Is that a fluke? Is that just an infrequent event? Should I carry the inventory to satisfy that infrequent event? Certainly, from a sort of a scientific and methodology standpoint, we had a better way of dealing with that. I guess really the last point in terms of reduced inventory management time leads into the next slide as well. I don't think there was necessarily less time spent in ordering. I think a lot of care was going into sort of mixing the art and the science. But what we did see, I think, a significant reduction in is the amount of time store management spent on exceptions. So, fewer back orders, fewer of, oh my God, it's the weekend and I've run out, or it's Monday morning and I'm out, and, better ability to keep displays up and so forth. But probably the final point, and which I think is very important, is just staff selling confidence. Heard again pretty repeatedly that in certain classes of product that maybe we're only carrying or have one item on display out on the sales floor, and you got to go to the stock room to get it, that there was considerably increased confidence by the selling staff to know it was going to be there.
Right. And so they could really work with the customer to sell them the products that fit the best without being worried about whether or not they could actually put it in their hands and send them home with it.
So the results of the pilot were positive. We made a decision to roll this chain-wide. By the fall, we had all the Houseware stores up and running on the year-round product store replenishment. I can say that during this period, we have, continued to monitor, work with the stores, get their input. We've had focus groups, and continue to improve and adjust. I think in terms of overall results, we typically really don't reveal specific, financial information, but I can say, looking at our investment, that the payback appears to be 3 to 6 months. And then, what's next? This is kind of a 4R slide that says, that they kind of cover everything in terms of year-round basic product to seasonal goods, and everything from replenishment to initial purchase and so forth. What we specifically are